Okay, so thank you all for joining us. This is Linda Curtis here from the League of Independent Voters. And joining us tonight are Michelle Gangnes and Mark Miller, who are going to be speaking. I'm going to give you a quick review of who they are in a minute. I do want to recognize Joe Cartetter, who's here from the Central Texas Water Coalition. And I'm not sure, Debbie's not on the line yet. We'll see if she joins us. Actually, come to think of it, Joan Escamilla, please put the name of the organization that you're working with now in Walker County. Put that in the chat for me real quick. If not, you can unmute and just tell us again, if that's easier.
I'm actually not currently with an organization, but I've always stayed with Pro Teams, which is a property rights organization in Grimes County.
Very good. All right. So, I'm sure you figured out now that the League of Independent Voters is not a political party. We did recently decide that we would endorse candidates for nonpartisan races, and we are endorsing some candidates that are running in the city council, San Antonio City Council runoffs that just started early voting on Monday. And it does appear that we could get maybe even a majority of the council that signed on in writing to supporting some very important SAWS reforms and oversight, and finally an audit of Vista Ridge. Now we know we're going to have to fight for that after the election is over, but we hope have some real allies and people that we have helped. Okay, so LIV is a nonprofit 501c4 organization, and our main theme is competitive elections and moving to multi-party elections, along with the development of solutions on big ticket items that really unite. Most Texans understand that energy and water is bread and butter that we all depend on. Tonight's topic on the big freeze and the big squeeze follows up first with Mark Miller talking about the freeze from last month's event, and we've been tracking this as best we can. As a huge piece of legislation, Senate Bill 3, and short of being a fly on the wall, which Mark could not be, we've been into this as deep as we possibly could. Our main topic tonight is led by Michelle Gangnes about the setting of the desired future conditions focused in GMA 12, which are counties to the east of Austin. They're listed on our page that will be set up after this event, so you can see that area again. We've sent this out, but the topic is relevant to all of Texas, and certainly because of the groundwater, surface water connection and setting desired future conditions. This relates to everybody who depends on the Colorado River and all of the surface water that's connected to all this groundwater pumping that is going on. So Michelle's going to talk about that. And we will hopefully have a lively Q&A, because I've asked them to do relatively short presentations so you guys can kind of get into it. Just to introduce the speakers, Mark Miller is an oil and gas expert, a petroleum engineer, and former faculty member at UT Austin. He became semi-famous in Texas running on the Libertarian line for Railroad Commission. And in 2016, he was endorsed by all the major newspapers that were endorsing in that election, received over 5% of the vote, thereby renewing the Libertarian Party's ballot status. Mark is no longer affiliated with the Libertarian Party, but he and Michelle are some of the plaintiffs, leading plaintiffs of a federal lawsuit that is in play right now, challenging the monopolistic ballot access laws in Texas that keep independents and minor parties marginalized or even off the ballot. This is going to come forward, we hope, soon, now that COVID is taking a step back, we hope. Michelle Gangnes is an attorney, landowner, and community volunteer who helped found LIV with me in 2013, a very dear friend who lives in Lee County, which is also at ground zero for the Vista Ridge pumping. Her history in protection of aquifers goes back 22 years. She's never been paid. She refuses to be paid. She is a volunteer that is the best that I know on this issue, and probably almost any other issue. Michelle never she's part of a group that we affectionately call the Water Wonks, that includes Simsboro Aquifer Water Defense leaders like herself. This is a 501c3 that she formed a few years ago. And the environmental stewardship led by Steve Box, they are working on all the technical things that we need to challenge the desired future conditions. This is, if they don't back off, this could turn into a major case for us all. So I'm not talking about legal yet. I'm talking about a case for sound management of groundwater. So on with the show. Mark, I'm going to turn this over to you. You're on.
All right. Thank you, Linda. I wasn't completely sure what I was getting into when Linda assigned me this task of following up on the big freeze. And I have spent the last several days going through what the legislature's been up to. And it's a lot. So let me at least try to summarize. Some of the rest of you may have been following a lot of this stuff, and if so, please clarify or add to what I'm talking about. I may have missed a lot of stuff. There may be some landmines in some of this legislation that that we need to talk about. And tonight I'm going to focus on two things that the legislature appears to be headed toward approving. One of them is what they call the securitization, basically of the financial losses incurred by wholesale providers, cooperatives, and gas and electrical utilities during the freeze. That basically how to pay for some of the costs that were incurred as a result of Uri. And the second one, I'll just call it regulatory reform. It's some new marching orders for primarily the PUC and the Railroad Commission. And I'd like to point out before we get started that all the bills I'm going to be talking about tonight had nearly unanimous bipartisan support, which means there was essentially no opposition. There have been some amendments to some of the bills, but both Democrats and Republicans are feeling like they need to do something. First of all, let me talk about the securitization bills. There are four of them. Senate Bill 1580, House Bill 1510, House Bill 1520, House Bill 4492. The House Bill 1510 is the only one that has been sent to the governor. The others are still in process. And all of them would have addressed these securitization costs, one for the cooperatives, one for the utilities, one for gas utilities, and the last one, 4492, for the wholesale market participants. And that's the big one. And I'll talk a little bit more about that maybe as we get to it. Like I said, all of these have passed, at least passed one house and are headed toward the other. Some of them, 1510, has, like I said, has been sent to the governor. 1580, which is for the cooperatives, had no opposition. It's passed by the House, but it was amended, so there's be a process of going through and either the Senate accepting those or moving on. In terms of regulatory reform, there were two bills. Both have been passed by both houses. Both, however, were amended by the House. That is Senate Bill 2 and Senate Bill 3. Senate Bill 2 primarily changes the governance structure of ERCOT. And it looks to me like it's a little bit of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but that's what's being done. The governor will now appoint the chair of ERCOT, requires the president and the CEO to be Texas residents, and the 5 experts that'll be on the board of directors of ERCOT must be approved by both the PUC and a majority of the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House. So it's become significantly more politicized, which could be good or bad depending on your point of view. There are some differences between the House and the Senate, so those presumably will be worked out in the next few days. Senate Bill 3 is sort of the omnibus bill. It's about 53 pages long. It's got a lot of stuff in it. And if you're interested in what's going on with these things, I would recommend you take a look at it. It has lots of different things in it. I think it's got something like 35 different sections, ranging from a power outage alert system to a process for designating critical facilities that need to be winterized, both from the gas and electric side. And it creates what's they're calling an electricity supply chain map. And I'll talk a little more about that in a few minutes. The main thing that the House did was added winterization of the natural gas system that was not in the Senate bill. Like I say, the Senate passed that original bill 31-0. The House amended it slightly. Most of the amendments were fairly innocuous that were on the floor, and it passed 142-1. So essentially no opposition. These bills interestingly enough, create some significant new entities in Texas. One of them that Senate Bill 3 would create is what's called the Texas Electricity Supply Chain Security and Mapping Committee. Its members will be the PUC and RRC, Railroad Commission Executive Directors, the President and CEO of ERCOT, and the Texas Department of Emergency Management Chief. This group will be required to meet quarterly. Its job will be to map the state's electricity supply chain, and the total from nuts to bolts, updated yearly. Identify critical infrastructure sources, those that have to be winterized. Develop a communication system between particularly the gas and the electric side. Establish some best practices for extreme weatherization, and recommend some oversight and compliance standards, and designate what kinds of things need priority service during extreme weather. It all sounds pretty good. I want to talk about, maybe too good to be true. We'll talk about that in a little bit. They have a mapping report that's due by the end of the year. So that's a lot of work to do before the end. The good thing is that these bills probably will pass by more than the 2/3, which means they'll become effective immediately. The other one that's kind of interesting is called the State Energy Plan Advisory Committee. The governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker of the House will each appoint 4 people, and the group will be tasked with creating a comprehensive state energy plan. Not total, but really about electricity, but they'll evaluate barriers in the electricity and natural gas markets that, quote, prevent sound economic decisions and make recommendations for change. Second would be to evaluate methods to improve the reliability, stability, and affordability of electric service. And lastly, evaluate electricity market structure and pricing mechanisms, which is something that certainly needs to be done. This is probably the closest thing we've got to an independent committee looking at any of this stuff. The report from that entity would be due the 1st of September 2022. So it'd be due right before the elections in 2022. There's also a couple of securitization groups that are being set up by House Bill 4492 and 1510 that look to me, I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, that look to be just avenues for doing the securitization, which is basically long-term bonds, so that the entities can find a way to finance their exorbitant costs, prevent some of them from going out of business, prevent some of them from passing on huge costs to the ratepayers. Let me add a couple of comments at the end, and then I'll turn it over to questions. If you haven't seen it, the University of Houston did an interesting survey right after the big freeze, looking at what people thought about what happened. And one of the interesting outcomes of that were that the entities that people were most satisfied with in terms of their behavior during the freeze were the energy co-ops. And we might want to talk about why that is. But the people that were served by co-ops, and I'll say from my standpoint of living in a co-op, I thought ours did did pretty well considering what other people in the state were going through. The other thing that I think hopefully will be addressed that clearly is an issue, at least from my standpoint, is the tightly coupled interdependence of electricity and natural gas. And I think even more so today than ever, a lot of that is because a lot of natural gas compression has moved from being generated using electricity rather than gas as the fuel. It's clearly an issue that must be addressed, and I hope the PUC and the Railroad Commission can figure out a way to work this together to get it addressed. Some of the articles that I've read suggest that the PUC and the Railroad Commission don't get along very well, and I don't know what that's about, but it's an interesting thing to consider. To me, the legislative session looks like we had to do something kind of thing, which legislatures are prone to do, particularly those that have a short time fuse and have to get something out the door. And I think that's why it's unanimous. I don't think anybody wants to be seen as standing in the way of something that would help move us in the right direction. It's also not clear to me, though, that the PUC and the Railroad Commission actually needed legislation to accomplish the things that are called for. I think some of these things could easily have been done in the past and just weren't. And so maybe this legislation, by requiring it, is kind of a kick in the butt to those two organizations. But to me, it points out to a failure of our regulatory agencies. And I have some questions that I still have that I'll just lay out here and see how people think about it. One of them is, I wonder whether voters will be assured that the legislature and our regulatory agencies actually will be able to fix the problems. That's not clear to me. These bills look pretty complicated and difficult for people to get their head around. It's also possible, I think, that a few more seasons of normal weather and people will forget about the big freeze, and this will be long gone. The other question I would have is who would the voters trust to address these technical issues? I know one of the things we talked about in the last session was an independent commission, and I wonder who would be on that commission that voters left and right, Democrat, Republican, and otherwise, who would they actually trust that could come up with some things that we would believe? I wonder whether the consumers will notice the securitization costs. The articles that I'm reading suggest that it's only going to be about $1 a month for most people. That's not something most of us would pay much attention to, but we will see it. And I think there were three really important issues that were not addressed, and I don't know that they're anywhere in the legislation. I may need to study it a little bit more. One of them was whether Texas ought to join the national grid rather than remaining a separate Texas-only grid. That seems to me to be something that should be debated and talked about. There are those also that have suggested we need to re-regulate the electricity market. I'm not sure that would ever happen, but there might at least be some things we need to change in the market, and maybe some of these committees will point that out. And of course, the idea of an independent commission was not really addressed much at all. And so let me finish off with my one of my favorite Albert Einstein quotes, which I think applies to this case, that goes like this: we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So that might be the problem that we have with our regulatory agencies is they're going to use the same thinking they have used in the past. And it's hard for me to imagine we will solve it in a way that makes sense. So let me stop and open that up for discussion.
Okay, I have a question that I prepared for you. I don't see any in the chat, so I'm going to start, and I'd like to actually just do 2 questions and move on because we are going to stop at 8, and the next session is the focus of this meeting, and it's complicated stuff. But my question to you, and hopefully you all have seen this in the LIV newsletter we sent out yesterday. If you didn't, if you missed a newsletter, it's always on the news page. And we linked to a piece that was put out by the Dallas Morning News watchdog, Dave Lieber, who is a great intellect, but talks like a regular person. because he's writing to a newspaper audience. And he says that the title of the article is that something like the children that have not yet been born are going to be, as an adult, paying for what just happened with the big freeze. And, $50 billion went somewhere, right? So $1 a month sounds like not a lot. But my question to you is that what he's referring to? What are your thoughts about that? Are we offloading, some profiteering outfits that walked off with all this money?
We always offload things to our children. It's one of the tragedies of government. Every time we incur debt, who's going to pay it? That debt will still be there when I'm long gone. My children and grandchildren will be paying for that debt one way or the other. Of course, what they're talking about is taking the costs, and it's not just the 50 billion that you were talking about, Linda. There's these securitization bills were also about all of the repairs and upgrades that need to happen as a result of Uri. Those were just billing charges. So they've sort of all been, looks to me like they've all been thrown into one pot, and basically allows the generators and the utilities to borrow money on a long-term basis. It basically just extends the cost out a number of years instead of paying it all right now. And on one level, yes, we're laying it on our children, but at the same time, it makes sense to, if we, the consumers, are going to pay for it. The question, of course, is whether we, the consumer, should pay for it or somebody else should. That's a different question. But once you've decided that consumers ought to pay for it, stretching it out over a number of years makes a whole lot more sense, particularly because interest rates are pretty low right now. In other words, this money could be borrowed at pretty good interest rates, and so the interest on that money would be low. But you're right, and he's right, that these costs will be paid long term.
Okay, one more question. Anybody got one? And thank you, Mark. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Michelle, are you there? And thank you again, Mark. That was excellent.
I'm here.
Okay, you're on, my dear.
I can't match Mark ever. He's always good. I appreciate that, Mark. That was a lot of food for thought. It just bothers me that they can't even decide how much money they're going to pass on to ratepayers or for how long, but we got to do something, and ratepayers are our only option, apparently. So good evening, everybody. I apologize for being on the telephone only. I live in an internet desert. First of all, I am nowhere near a wonk. So for my sake, I have to avoid getting too technical. This is a really tough subject, though, so I'll do my best. The wonks that are listening would be probably tearing their hair out for what I'll gloss over. Also, I've been a Texas lawyer for 46 years. Linda didn't even know that, but never have been a water lawyer. So that and senility are my three disclaimers tonight.
She's not seen it.
Linda asked me to spend a few minutes on one element of water policy planning that groundwater districts collectively engage in every 5 years. And we're in the midst of the 2017 to 2022 planning period now. So locally, we're located in Lee County and Linda in Bastrop County, 5 districts covering 11 counties, plan together at periodic meetings under the umbrella of a Groundwater Management Area 12, or we call it GMA 12. They are in GMA 12 because they manage the various parts of the central Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer that lies under those counties. Representative of Lost Pines, which is Lost Pines, which is Bastrop and Lee counties, Post Oak Savannah, which is Milam and Burleson counties, Fayette County Groundwater District, Brazos Valley Groundwater District, that's Brazos and Robertson counties, and then to the farther east, Mideast GCD serve on GMA 12. GMA 12 itself is not considered a legal entity that can be sued, but the actions they take in planning what's called the desired future conditions of our aquifers are subject to challenge through an administrative contested case hearing. That would determine whether the impacts are unreasonable or the DFCs themselves are not reasonable or achievable, various issues like that. So Chapter 36 of the Texas Water Code governs that planning process and any challenges if you're dying to know more about it. Currently, the 5-year period ends on January 5, 2022, with the adoption by the individual districts of final desired future conditions. In the meantime, each groundwater district is currently in the midst of a 90-day public comment period, and they each have to have at least one public hearing during that period or at the end of it, and then they have to finish their business by January. We think they have plenty of time to correct all the mistakes they've made so far. This planning period is turning into a hotbed of public outcry in at least one groundwater district, mine, the Lost Pines district in Lee and Bastrop counties. The 5 districts adopted proposed new DFCs for adoption by each district back in April, and that's what started this public comment period. So SAWDF, Simsboro Aquifer Water Defense Fund, and Environmental Stewardship are aligned in opposing the proposed DFCs, and we're asking the 5 districts to reject them. It's a 2/3 vote to adopt the proposed ones, and it's a 2/3 vote to override them. Otherwise, they'll become the final DFCs for each district, and each district will actually formally adopt DFCs. They have not done anything to adopt DFCs so far. They've just proposed DFCs. So we believe if the issues we serviced at GMA 12, and I have to give ultimate credit to Environmental Stewardship because they've been active in all 3 planning periods since DFC planning began in, I guess, 2010. So we believe if we get enough publicity, there'll be additional public interest in the other districts. But we believe Lost Pines and the Post Oak district, where the Vista Ridge project is located, and the Colorado River that Steve Box and Environmental Stewardship guard have the most to lose here. I should mention that my county, Lee, and the other eastern counties also have a stake in the health of the Brazos River. So what are desired future conditions, or DFCs, which I shorthand them as, and why do we care about them? They're most easily described as what do we want our aquifers to look like in 50 years with updates every 5 years that moves that horizon another 5 years out. So we're planning now for DFCs through 2070. In GMA 12, each GMA sets their criteria for what their desired future conditions will be based on. In GMA 12, they're expressed in terms of how much average drawdown of water levels in each aquifer formation on a county-wide and district-wide basis a member district will tolerate before steps are taken to avoid deeper drawdowns. You care about the DFCs if you're a water marketer, obviously, but also just as obvious, landowners who own the groundwater under them, landowners who depend on wells for domestic and livestock, any community that depends on groundwater need to or expect the wells they depend on to be able to adapt to changes in water levels in the aquifer, to be resilient so that you can access the quantity and quality of water you need. We also care about the groundwater DFCs because of the dependence of rivers, springs, and streams on the contributions of groundwater to their flows and to their resilience in times of drought. We care about aquifers in our central Texas counties because we do in fact depend on groundwater out here. But the bigger picture, of course, is that our groundwater represents our and our future generations' ability to survive and thrive. We need our aquifers to be sustainable, not mined to depletion. We call it managed depletion to avoid the word mining, usually. That's currently underway, largely due to huge export projects aimed mostly at our Simsboro aquifer. The Simsboro is a sweet spot for water marketers and their export projects to support growth and development elsewhere. The Vista Ridge project in the Post Oak district came online in 2020 with maximum pumping right off the bat, rather than the typical ramp up of pumping to the permit maximums that usually occurs over a period of years. They pump in 2 different aquifer formations, the Carrizo Aquifer and the Simsboro, and single-handedly, they have caused that project to become the 800-pound gorilla in the room where the proposed DFCs were set last April. Vista Ridge has also already caused many well failures in the Carrizo Aquifer in both Burleson and Lee counties. And by itself, Vista Ridge pumping over the next decades is expected by Environmental Stewardship and its experts to cause the Colorado River, however many miles from Burleson County it is, to become a losing stream rather than the gaining stream it is now. I want to preface the rest of remarks on what's going on with DFCs on something our good friend in Milam County, Dr. Curtis Chubb, who I wish were on the phone tonight, but I don't think he is. He just said this to Linda and me today in an email about this fiasco called setting the DFCs. He said, Linda and Michelle, something has gone bad wrong with the DFC process. According to Doctors Mace and Petrosian, these were well-respected scientists and hydrologists who wrote a report called A Streetcar Named Desired Future Condition several years ago. And in that they said, in essence, a desired future condition is a management goal that captures the philosophy and policies addressing how an aquifer will be managed. What do you want your aquifer to look like in the future? I always thought desired meant a goal, not a reverse engineered number, end quote. Let me tell you in the time I have left what he meant by reverse engineered is really quite simple. The Water Code says DFCs must provide a balance between the highest practicable level of groundwater production and the conservation, preservation, protection, recharging, and prevention of waste of groundwater and control of subsidence in the management area. To achieve that balance, the Water Code sets out 9 factors, which I won't go into detail about, but basically they tell you to consider impacts. They instruct the districts in GMA 12 and all GMAs to weigh, meaning use their honest judgment and their research and their data and their best available science to weigh 9 factors, including impacts of the DFCs on aquifer conditions, on management strategies and approved projects in the state water plan, water budgets, sustainability, the environment, including surface water impacts specifically, private property rights and socioeconomic impacts, feasibility of whether DFCs can be achieved, and other issues. All of that leads me to tell you what's gone bad about the DFCs, or at least one of the more immediate reasons it's gone bad. It has been going bad over the course of all 3 DFC planning periods. The 800-pound gorilla, Vista Ridge, successfully threatened, we believe, enough litigation against the 5 groundwater districts for all manner of harm and constitutional takings without compensation for their gazillion billion dollars invested in fleecing San Antonio ratepayers, with the cooperation of SAWS, that all the groundwater districts in GMA 12, who by the way can be sued, backed down and abandoned their duty under the Water Code. In April of this year, GMA 12 proposed new DFCs that just about double the allowable drawdowns in the 2 aquifers that Vista Ridge pumps and lowered all the other formations' allowable drawdowns to boot. What GMA 12 has done is to accommodate maximum pumping for big permits while failing to protect and in fact further imperiling household and domestic wells in the Colorado River system. The DFCs that they propose completely fail to give any consideration to any of the 9 factors except what I call big pumper projects. Think of it as a seesaw with big pumpers on the ground with weights on and all other 8 factors up in the air on the other end of the seesaw. We use the term reverse engineered to describe what happened because they used the groundwater availability model, computer model, to help them, not to help them weigh the impacts of various levels of pumping, but to set the DFCs by determining how much demand there was in these maximum pumping amounts, and that became the DFCs, whatever drawdowns that produced in the computer run. So it's not, in the face of well failures that we now calculate in Carrizo wells in Lee County will cause probably 88% of them to either fail or have to be mitigated, and many more than that probably in Burleson County, and then the effects on the Colorado River when Vista Ridge was already going to cause it great harm. It's not hard to believe why we're upset. So I'll stop there, and sorry to go long, and hope for some questions or discussion.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay. Does anybody have questions? And if so, I think what we could do actually is just open this up. This is a small enough group where you all can ask your questions. You don't have to put them in the chat. I guess I'll ask you a question. Uh-oh, we've got an echo going on. David, are you
That
there?
that may have been where I just unmuted. Um,
Go
uh,
ahead, Jeff. Did you have a question?
yeah, actually, what I was going to mention was what I mentioned to you the other day. Um, I think it would be a good idea if we sent surveys out to neighborhood association leaders concerning the condition of the wells. And this came about, I went out to do a little work near Elgin, and asked the people about if they knew about the Vista Ridge pipeline, and remarkably they didn't. And they had quite a few acres there, and they're in close proximity to the pipeline. So anyway, as a means of getting the word out and also uh, registering with folks exactly what this amounts to, I think a survey would be helpful, and also to monitor what's going on with the wells out there. So, and one final point, to bring well owners or private, well, I guess it is well owners, people with private wells, to bring them together in a network so they can communicate, because there's nothing like having a neighbor tell you firsthand, hey, my well is dry and I have little recourse. And so anyway, just a thought.
Okay. Joe, I see you unmuted, and I know this is a big topic, so I'm going to go to you and just ask if you want to
Good.
jump
Thank
in.
you. I first of all, I wanted to thank Michelle. I'm up in the upper basin, and so it's different. Up here, where we're dealing with the public hearings, no one goes. No one knows anything. And if you do attend one of the meetings, they'll do the sit around, you know, the check off thing. Well, which do you think is the best? Why do you? And of course, if you don't have a background in water, which most normal people do not. I mean, I know we're all water nerdy and energy nerdy.
Not all of us.
Well, you wouldn't be involved. You know more than you think you would. But I think I've been really pleased with what you guys have done in sending out what's going on. Of course, Steve Box is a good friend, and he's always keeping me up with what's going on. But it comes back to the thing about using real science and following real science. And the other thing I think to think about is for well owners, there is no recourse. During the last drought, when wells went dry, there was no one. I'd have people call me and say, my well's dry, what do I do? And there was nowhere to send them. I mean, if you were a retired lady out on your little farm, and you didn't have the money to deepen your well, to dig your well deeper, or to get a tank and pull it in. So I think the key is in education on a lot of this. And water doesn't have to be as complicated as it appears to be by the people who do not want people like us and you guys involved in this. They do not want to have people. So I've been really impressed with your group, Linda and Michelle. I've seen you speak at other things when these things have been going on. But I just think it's a matter of the survey idea, as Jeff was saying. Anything that will educate people is what you need to do in simple, easy terms, so that it's not an ordeal, and it doesn't obfuscate an issue. Just cut and dry. That was 2 cents worth.
Very good. Michelle, would you like to respond to Joe and Jeff?
Anything that educates is a great idea, and that's really what we hope to be doing. We're a very small volunteer group we're just a board, basically. We're not a membership organization. We have lots of people that, are interested and supportive. We've lately been involved in a contested case involving the LCRA's desire to go into the groundwater business in Bastrop County with a project that's about half the size of Vista Ridge, and that will be a disaster on the other end of our groundwater district.
Right.
So we get spread thin pretty easily, but education is one of the, big motivators that we want to capitalize on. And we have one board member who's actually young, and relatively young, and he's about to retire from his employment. So he would be a great educator, and we're hoping to turn him loose. I mean, he's done all of our graphics and our work. So I think we're on the same track, Joe, and Jeff, but it's really hard to educate people who turn on the tap and water comes out. And I don't mean to sound cliched, but it is really difficult to get people to appreciate until that well goes dry. So we've got a bunch of people that are experiencing that right now. And my other ox I'd like to gore are our groundwater districts. They do nothing to educate anybody, or at least ours doesn't. Post Oak does a pretty good job of educating, but you get the filtered story because they've saddled themselves with Vista Ridge since 2004. So, you know, we're up against it. So a survey, whoever would help us develop that would be great. We have just well surveys we're trying to get from people who we know might be affected, and so we're very, very micromanaged on it right now. But yes, we do have to broaden our reach. All of us do.
Yeah, I want to jump in here for a second, Michelle, because when she says we, she's talking about Simsboro Aquifer Water Defense Fund, which is a 501c3 education-oriented group. Andy Weir just joined us, who's on the board, who's done a remarkable job of providing a lot of the materials and updates, and he's an amazing person. If I had money, I'd hire him right now to run the League of Independent Voters. But to understand the need for, I want to make sure people understand the need for, when we talk about education, you know, SAWDEF does a remarkable job, so does environmental stewardship. They're very focused on the issue and the science and the law, but there's also that role for a 501c4 active organization to reach large numbers of people to do a little bit of education. And so in San Antonio, when you talk to people about Vista Ridge, I'm not saying that everybody knows about it, but there is a lot of people who know about it because they're taking it in the shorts from SAWS, and they can't stand SAWS. SAWS has been doing that kind of education for us, and we didn't go away. We've stayed there. We did a petition drive. We didn't make the ballot because of COVID, but we talked to tens of thousands of voters over the last number of years, and we're not going away. We're going to keep after them. So that mass organizing is really important to these issues, whether it's the big freeze or the big squeeze. I deeply appreciate the expertise that these people bring to us because we couldn't do it, but we can take it out and make it understandable and give people access in the communities. Okay, I'll shut up now.
No. I also want to just say, and then I'll hush. We have about 4,000 members. We're a 501c4. What I have found is that it is hard, and that's why, Linda, I've appreciated you so much. Everybody's in their silo. You know, you've got every little environmental group has their, well, what's your agenda? Your agenda is not the same as ours. We will never make the changes that need to be made for energy or water or just life in general if we do not reach out more and interact and eliminate some of those silos so that it's more of a unified approach. You can tell I'm frustrated from this legislative session.
Well,
You know,
okay, I will say one more thing. There is such a failure going on in Texas on bread and butter. This is a moment, a turning point where we're all going to have to figure out, how do we do this together? So
right.
we're not going to figure it out tonight on the call, but we need to be staying in better touch, and we will figure this out. I hope. We've got to. So more comments and questions. We've got another 12 minutes or so.
It's Joan here, Escamilla in Grimes County. Just want to say that one of the things that might benefit is the youth, of course, and I have learned more from 4-H youth, whether it was just challenges on, and remember some of these commercials that are coming on with these children saying, you're going to need us for our ideas. Well, let's glean that youthful strength, energy, and tap into the 4-H to see how we can challenge them how to conserve water, maybe do challenges on taking a shower bath with a 2-gallon bucket of water that you warmed on the stove, and show people that they can conserve while we figure out the rest. That's it.
Anybody want to respond to that? All right, Judy Jorish, you had a comment or question? Judy, are you still there?
Well, this is Peggy. This is
Go ahead.
Peggy.
Go ahead.
And I really do like that idea of going to the 4-H groups and challenging them to find solutions for water conservation and all that. That's such a great idea.
Feeling Andy Weir would love that one too. I'm sorry, did I interrupt anybody?
No, I just finally found the unmute.
Okay, go ahead, Judy.
I was just looking at this from the outside, which of course makes you see bigger things connected. I just was wondering if people there are talking about the folks who really made a lot of money off of the freeze, sort of following the money in all of this. And was there any objection to the price gouging that went on and the some of the billions in profits while people were just suffering and lost everything? So is there any talk about paying back into recovery from those that, I look at some of the charts of the price gouging that was going on for electricity and supplies. Is that of concern to folks, or people thinking of ways of having them reinvest some of that into recovery or into resource saving, or is that not a direction that you all are thinking about?
Mark, would you allow me to kick in first on this one?
Sure.
This is really a political question that Judy is raising, which is not surprising because I know Judy well. And it is my question. And populist Linda is just totally outraged by all this money that some seem to disappear. And I know that's a broad stroke that is totally inaccurate. It doesn't really describe what happened. But so far, we have been unable to do what you would normally do to get a group of people together to say, look, we don't want this buried. We want a commission. We want an investigation. We tried to do that a few weeks ago and it didn't happen. That said, where there's a will, there's a way. And this is what I think, just me personally, that this is going to have to come out in these 2 years that we're leading up to the 2022 election cycle. These candidates that are coming forward, this is going to be a big election. There's a lot of unhappiness inside both parties and independent voters as well. And this is one of the big issues, as well as what is happening with our water. Mark, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I agree with that, Linda, is that there doesn't seem to be much appetite in the legislature for doing that. And there certainly doesn't seem to be much appetite with the governor. We have a new PUC. Maybe they'll do something about it. Maybe they won't. The thing that came closest to addressing the issue was some of these securitization bills allowed some of those excessive costs to be basically financed. And the other thing that there was one bill that got rid of the most egregious contracts, which were the wholesale pass-through contracts, which allowed people to have really low rates, but put them at risk for these really high rates. And those are the ones we saw where people had exorbitant prices, as they had enrolled in these wholesale contracts. And so there's a bill that's working its way through that would outlaw those. And that's sort of the closest that I can see that we've come. And I agree. It's going to be up to whoever runs for office in 2022 to keep that alive. And for those of us that are concerned about it, to support candidates that are willing to talk about that issue and at least spur the press to continue. I haven't seen much even in the press about it lately.
Other than Dave Lieber.
Yeah, and that really didn't get at the 50 billion accounting. It just said it's unfair about how it's being financed. But your question is, where did it go and who profited and who didn't profit? And there's pieces of it, but I don't understand why there can't be an accounting. I don't get that at all. Most accounting systems, where the money went. So that just doesn't make any sense to me at all. So either ERCOT's accounting system is totally screwed up, or somebody's hiding something.
I think it's a great issue, and I think there's going to be candidates all over this that have any brains at all. So that's my prediction anyway, for what it's worth, which ain't much usually. But Andy Weir or anybody else want to make a comment? We've got 5 more minutes and or questions. Just unmute and you can talk.
Okay. I would like to know if they can do the Vista Ridge project without 0 interest rates, or what the financing assumptions are behind that massive project.
Michelle, you want to try to answer Roger's question? You have to unmute. Michelle, you have to unmute your phone. There you go.
Sorry, I was double muted. I had my own self muted. That's Roger. Roger could answer this question in his sleep. He knows that the Vista Ridge is a public-private partnership, and the private side is looking out like a bandit because they control the groundwater permits, and they built the well field, they built the pipeline, and they're selling water to SAWS for the next 30 years. And at the end of that 30 years, SAWS takes over the project, inherits the ownership of the project, except for the groundwater permits. And so they still have to buy water from the private side in Carson County.
Yeah. I'm curious about whether it's liable to work or not. And I'm sure there must be even a different inexpert opinion on that topic.
Michelle? She's in that donut hole up there in Lee County, and she's going in and out of service. She may chime back in a second here. Andy Weir who's on the SAWDF board.
I'm still on, Linda.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, somehow I guess I got muted again, so sorry. Roger, do you mean if it's feasible physically or financially or both, or?
Financially, basically, and what assumptions of growth are really behind that, and how realistic are they, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'll answer real simplistically. The water that Vista Ridge represents to San Antonio, 50,000 acre feet, 16 billion gallons a year, was not needed for decades, if ever. And the nature of that deal, the demand that the private side made, take it or leave it right now, caused SAWS to enter into a contract that made no sense. And so they knew they couldn't put Vista Ridge water in the ground in the aquifer storage that they have. They have to put Edwards water in there, and they knew that people would be outraged if they pulled groundwater from here and put it back in the ground there. So they overhauled their system to take in the Vista Ridge water right away. So all of that had huge cost overruns and was a fiasco. They dumped billions of gallons of water on the ground while they tried to get ready to hook up. So that's just a minor blip. But the overall project is just not particularly financially feasible for ratepayers, because I have a feeling that the rates are going to just have to keep going up and up because of all these unforeseen things that happen. And the profit margins built in to keep the private side whole, so they're happy as long as the ratepayers can afford it. But there's another interesting wrinkle developing in that I think it's A&M studying this aspect of the more we pump our aquifers, the less accessible the water becomes, and the more difficult and expensive it is to lift it out of the ground. And so when everybody talks about there's plenty of water available, yes, there may be, but it's prohibitively expensive to get that water out of the ground, and nobody wants to talk about the actual cost that's going to have to be passed on to ratepayers. So it's becoming evident that we've got some real problems and we're not doing much to solve them. So I'll stop there, but that gives you an idea that I don't think it's feasible either physically, because it's going to deplete our aquifers too much, nor is it financially feasible for San Antonio.
It is almost 8 o'clock, did want to make sure people knew that Andy Weir posted in the chat that SAWDEF is developing a 5th grade science curriculum on aquifers and water conservation. So we are deeply indebted to SAWDEF as well as Steve Box's environmental stewardship, Joe Cartetter and the Texas Water Coalition. I want to see what we can do together more in the future. I'm so glad you're here tonight. And thank you as always to Michelle and Mark for advising LIV and keeping us doing as much as we possibly can. Who was it that said, never, never, never give up? I think it was Winston Churchill. So I hope to see you guys on a regular basis. Our next forum is going to be talking about independent voters, and are we just swing voters or do we have some other role to play? And that forum is on June 14th. For those of you who focus on the policy issues, I hope you will engage in a little bit of electoral politic imagination with us at that forum. Thank you all, and we'll be sending out an email when this event is put up online with some of the details and articles that we've used to prepare this event. I guess that's it. Y'all have a great evening.